Yeah, so who's everybody? Just real quick, show of hands. Who's a developer? How about designer? And who works with data? Just okay, all right. Shocking, right? I have some bad news. You have all been lied to. That's right, you're being lied to all the time by your own brain. What you see, what you hear, what you feel is constantly shaped by your emotions, by your memories, by your moods, by your beliefs. This perception of the world is the creation of the brain, and it is shaped by our senses. My name is Luis, and I make things with data and pixels. I grew up in Mexico City, and I moved here to the US about 16 years ago. My background is in information systems and interaction design. I got into data visualization when I was working at JP Morgan as a systems analyst. I was creating dashboards for business executives. That made me realize how little I knew about design. So I went back to school to study interactive design. And now I do consulting work on user experience, front-end development, data visualization, and user interface. This talk is about self-expression, communication, and human connection. It is about data and our senses. I'm going to start off with this painting, the allegory of the five senses. It's by a Dutch painter named Gerard de la Red. Our senses have always been an interest to people, as we can attest by this old painting from the 1600s. Your experience with data can be better if we use more of our senses. It allows us to tell better stories, make our information more approachable. By investing time in understanding our emotions, it allows for, by investing more time in ourselves, trying to understand ourselves, it allows us to be more in tune with our environment. So what can you expect today from this talk? I will start off by showing you some projects that inspire me around the five senses. Then I'll move on to my projects and my process. I'll show you two projects. And then I'll open it up for questions. I'm going to start with sight. This is about seeing the invisible. So think of the waves of information we cannot see. The ones that are passing through buildings, walls, and our bodies. But what if we could see those patterns? Materials is a project by Timo Arnold. He light paints with LEDs and Wi-Fi using low exposure photography. He walks around with a stick, Wi-Fi antenna with LEDs connected to it. As he walks around, there's a camera set up with low exposure settings, capturing the different patterns of these waves. It's a cross-section of our Wi-Fi networks in the space we live in. I like this project because it opens our mind for the possibility of experiencing things that they're right in front of us, but we cannot see. Things that we're so used to and accustomed to, but we're too busy to explore or notice. But what if you could taste data? Imagine you're brushing your teeth in the morning, and the flavor of the toothpaste could tell you if you're going to need an umbrella or rain boots. This is what David Carr did at the MIT Media Lab. Tastes like rain. It's a toothpaste dispenser hooked up to a Linux box. It's running weather forecasting software. Then a modified toothpaste gets extruded. If it's minty, it's going to rain. And if it tastes like cinnamon, that means that today will be warmer than yesterday. Taste is linked to many receptors in our brain, and it gives us the opportunity to trigger and prepare the body in ways that we don't think they were possible before. Now think of a message you received recently. What did it smell like? Oldie is a Kickstarter project that turns notifications into scents. So imagine getting a scent of your boyfriend's cologne when he tweets at you. Or the nice warm coffee smell in the morning when your alarm goes off. Or how about some buttery popcorn when the movie's about to start? I like these projects because smell is a very powerful trigger, and paired with the appropriate technology, it can enhance our communication tremendously. Now touch data. Imagine if we could break the barrier between the physical and digital worlds. This is what Jose Duarte did. He has a very interesting approach to physically visualizing data. He created this kit, Handmade Visuals. It allows us to craft data in the physical world. It's doing it by using very basic materials such as sticks, threads, balloons, stickers. I like this project because it leads with the idea that we can make information more intimate and more real by physically interacting with it. Now, think of something complex. Something like a sorting algorithm. We might not fully understand how the mechanics of it, of how it works. Well, maybe, probably many of you here will know. But if we're able to hear it, it can give us more depth and more understanding. Timo Bingman has this project called The Sound of Sorting. Here, white bars represent unordered values. The red bar is the current position of the algorithm. And as it moves through, the next bar turns red and the values get swapped. I'll show you how this works. Now, but first, if you're sensitive to flashes and noises or things like that, epilepsy, I don't know, you should close your eyes now. So what is happening is an organization based on certain characteristics. But once you hear it, you can grasp how the algorithm is working. If you hear a beep, it means that it's reading the value. If you hear a pop, it means that it's getting sorted. I don't know, there's something really satisfying looking at this. I like this project because of the idea of making complex subjects more approachable. It opens the opportunity for new projects in education and in accessibility. And that's our census. Now I'm going to move on to my projects. I will start off with TalkLog. Here, I wanted to tell the story based on my phone call metadata. Each bubble represents a phone call. The length of the call is represented by the size of this bubble. Green calls are incoming, outgoing calls are purple. This can be sorted in many different ways. Input versus incoming versus outgoing, top left corner. Time of the day, top right. 0 hours to 23. Time of the year on bottom left, January through December. And we can also overlap multiple filters on top of each other, bottom right quadrant. First by time of the day, and then incoming versus outgoing. This representation of information gave my life meaning. It helped me remember it in a very poetic way. It tells the story of my sleeping habits by the lack of data at the top. And it shows my conference calls in the 9 to 5 block, all about half an hour to an hour long, every day. And then on the bottom, we see shorter, less frequent personal calls. Here we see another view with the conference calls closer to the right, and a big green bubble late at night. Conversation with a girlfriend at the time. And this is how I did it. First, I downloaded my data from my service provider and wrote a program that would generate particles based on each data point of my call log, creating essentially a particle system with my phone calls metadata. I use my SQL to query and store that data, and processing to visualize it. This next project really represents what really excites me about working with data. It's part of a personal experiment on tracking my emotions. I built a set of sculptures that would light up based on my mood. I call them empathy totems. This project has two parts, a web app for inputting data and a light sculpture to represent it. I see this project as a non-verbal communication tool. Now I'm going to take you through my process, from concept, research, design to build, starting with concept. But first, I'm going to flip through some images. What you just experienced is empathy. The reason you're able to empathize with these people and have an idea of how these people are feeling in that specific scenario without you even knowing them is because of this concept called mirror neurons. These are neurons that get activated when we perform an action or when we see somebody else performing that action. So these neurons are mirroring each other. So the next example, we see an image of a researcher sticking his tongue out and then mirrored by the monkey. This proves that by observing a body language, we can relate it to ourselves and communicate it. Now, behind the name, empathy totems. Empathy is that ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And totem is an object that serves as a symbol for a group of people. And they have been used in many cultures and to create connections and communication. This is how the system works. It starts off with an emotion that gets recorded on your device, sends to the cloud for storing and processing, and then to the light to be represented and change the environment in which it lives. Now into research. I came across this concept, the state of consciousness, called flow. During flow, people experience total involvement in life and deep enjoyment. It was proposed by this psychologist, Hungarian psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he wrote a book about it. In his book, there's this diagram. It guides you in determining what kind of experience you're having. So by assessing the task at hand between challenge and skill levels, you can determine what that experience looks like. Flow, in this case, being the most optimal experience. Apathy being the complete opposite, when the skill is low-level skill and the challenge is low challenge. Contrasted by anxiety, a higher challenge and a low skill set level. Now, I'll talk about the design of the application. First, the first prototype, I based it on Mihai's model of flow. We have a mobile device to input among the 9 quadrants. And each record records a mood and a timestamp. I tested this for about a month, and it didn't work. It felt too academic and too rigid. So when I was hanging out with friends, it was hard to express my experience in a challenge versus skill level. So I did something else. I looked into the medical field. There I found that mood tracking was heavily used to treat patients with bipolar disorder, using charts like this. We have a cell for each day of the month with a mood rating scale, and they also added anxiety and irritability. However, these forms are cumbersome, hard to maintain, aggregate, and analyze. And honestly, I was getting more anxious and more irritable looking at it. So I created a more user-friendly version for a mobile app concept. Here, moods can be inputted 3 times a day, and 3 convenient sliders to express your mood from sad face to happy face, or really happy face. And your level from anxiety and irritability, from little to a lot. But I decided to explore something more abstract, something that would be easier for people to adopt. I decided just to have a slider without the interface of the actual slider. The screen being the interface itself. Adjusting the Y and X axis changes the hue and brightness of the screen. During my testing, the feedback I received, during my testing, I received feedback that the more abstract way was preferable. It allowed people to give their own meaning to their gestures and colors, instead of trying to learn and adhere themselves to my way of quantifying and tracking mood. So I found that each person was using the totem in a total different way. Jenny, for example, she was having a crappy day at work. Right? We've all had those. Here she inputs her mood, and the totem changes at home. Her significant other sees the totem and understands her emotions and has a nice meal prepared for her when she comes home. Or think of yourself when you're at work. You're in deep focus, in the zone, maybe in this state of flow, and you get interrupted. What if everyone at work would have their own totem, indicating their emotions or their status? So if they're in the zone, or if they're available to chat, or do not disturb. Now I'll show you some of the physical prototypes from the building phase. Here I'm using an Arduino to control an LED. An Arduino is an open source hardware microcontroller that allows us to interact with sensors and other electronics. implementation of the first wireframes that we saw. The LEDs display your level of flow. This is hosted. This is by entering your emotion through a web browser. Now, for the physical structure of the totem, I wanted something organic yet precise. So I looked at crystals for inspiration. I started with toothpicks and glue, and then using a ping pong ball to act as a diffuser of the LED, as a light diffuser. And then I scaled up the design to a larger structure. Wrapped it around rice paper to bring that organic aesthetic I was looking for. Here's the first system. Now including the Arduino and the LED. And here we can see how the rice paper diffuses the light. And now into integrating the application. For this version, I was using my computer hooked up to the totem to process all the information and control the Arduino. For the next iteration, I wanted something more portable, and I had to take my computer out of the equation to be able to test in different environments and in different scenarios. So I incorporated a Raspberry Pi to host the application and to provide network connectivity to the totem. I replaced the RGB LED that I had with a NeoPixel ring, which is an array of more powerful LEDs. I also replaced the Arduino with a Teensy. It's a smaller microcontroller, more powerful and smaller form factor, and still running that Arduino code. I added a Wi-Fi router, so it could be a standalone device, and I could take it around without worrying, looking for a Wi-Fi connection. And it's all housed in a 12 by 12 wooden box. Then I laser cut a piece of illustration board based on the specifications of the totem. And then I moved on into digitalizing the toothpick structure, so I can experiment with different materials and different scales. Here we see the setup live for the first time. Full-on interaction with the, you can't see it, but that's my phone. So full interaction with the LEDs through a Wi-Fi connection. Now, for the next version, I scaled up the structure and laser cut out of a chipboard. Here I'm testing those parts with different types of papers, different shapes, more tests, more concepts. Now putting it all together. Here's a view from the inside. And here's the current prototype, all assembled. And now with the final view, this is on top of the on top of the box housing the components. And this is the final version lit up. What I learned from these prototypes is that everybody had their own way of understanding, interpreting, and communicating their emotions. This experiment just acted as a stage for people to explore mood tracking and other ways of communicating with each other. I want you to think of outside of bar charts and pie charts, and look into representing information more in tune with our senses. I want to inspire you to make data more human. This allows us to tell better stories and makes our message more expressive. Now, my exploration of the senses is a work in progress. I would like to hear your thoughts on how we can advance this agenda. You can find me on Twitter at Cielak, and I also have all the totem code on GitHub. Any questions? Yeah.
Have you considered that the input device is not going to be an action that a person does, something like biometrics? So, because just the interaction, you know, if I need to convey something manually somewhere, that is like, you know, deviation of errors. Sometimes, you know, the system doesn't work and I get fixed and I get upset about just the user interface. There are some biometric devices I was seeing that can measure all the time your move.
Yeah, as a user interface designer, I hate screens. And everything that we do is a screen. Right? We started to think a lot of like screen, where does it go on the screen?
No, I'm saying something
yeah, that's my point. And that's why my prototypes kind of moved away from so much inputting into a device, right? We all walking around looking down. So I moved more into gestures, right? But still, it was still with the phone. And yeah, absolutely. I tried for a while strapping myself with a bunch of sensors like Fitbits or heart rate monitors, things like that. Apple has that idea too with the Apple Watch, right? That you can send somebody else a heartbeat. So yeah, and I think this is a very exciting time to be looking into this as all these sensors and input devices become more widely available and more accessible. So yeah, so definitely I'm looking to expand this into more wearables, more data that's being tracked without me having to track it. Yeah.
You said that multiple different people could use different colors to represent the same emotions. Have you tried looking at saying if different patterns of emotions using different colors could be clustered together to mean the same thing, different people using different patterns of colors?
Yeah, so I run into a lot of cultural issues and perception of colors where really opposites, right? Like for some cultures, red is the best thing. For other cultures, red is the worst thing. And no matter what you do, if you're going to show the color, that there's already that misconception of the emotion. So on my last studies, I found that the most successful tests were when people would agree in this communication. It's like another level of their own communication expressed by a new tool. Yeah.
What, if anything, do you do to calibrate your sensor, your estimation of an emotion?
Could you repeat that, please?
What would you do? What do you do to calibrate?
Life. Yeah. I think our emotions cannot be calibrated, right? They change day to day. What upsets you today will not upset you tomorrow, perhaps. Or maybe I'm not understanding the question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how do you know that your estimate that someone is happy is at all true?
You don't. You're never just happy. It's never one emotion, right? It's an array or a set of emotions, and they're not really ones and zeros. It's more of a slider of a happiness slider, right? And yeah, right? Yeah, and mood swings, right? So when I was tracking my mood, I had a reminder, right? Every 3-4 times a day. I would press, oh, I'm happy. Am I sad? I don't know. And that was the answer. That was the answer I was looking for. I realized that I couldn't really name one specific mood that I was feeling at one time, and that didn't really matter. What mattered was to stop and to think that, okay, how do you feel right now? And I don't think we do enough of that. check in with ourselves and really try to understand why or how we're feeling. Yeah.
Built into the system that your current prototype, do you have a log of what an individual emotion was over a certain period of time? Because I know it's like real time in that totem and entropy.
Yeah. So I would store all that, all the gestures, and then I was thinking, like, okay, what if we can have a light show of my moods of the Monday? And it's like, oh, okay. I mean, it didn't really represent Monday, but yeah, that was an experiment with that. Yeah.
So, like, have you created this product? So, how many people are using it?
Well, these were just my prototype is not not really, I guess, made for production, but yeah, I mean, used it about like 10 people helped me test it out.
Yeah, so I was going to, so 10 people help you test it out. I feel like I was just kind of wondering more the results. So, like after the results, what was there? What was the conclusion? I know that's a lot.
No, yeah, and that was something I kept stumbling on. Right? After I would change something, I was like, okay, I changed it for this reason, and now I adapted it to something else. What are the results? And it would always be the same results, that people track things differently, people have emotions differently, and maybe that you pick that color that day because you were happy, but the next day that color doesn't represent that you're happy. So representing mood with color was tough. Yeah.
So would it be fair to say that you set out to measure, to quantify,
Mm-hmm.
to learn from quantitative?
Yeah.
But you realized that the standard devices, input mechanisms we had were just not suitable. So you made some, artistically inspired experiments.
Sure.
And you learned some things, but they're not solutions. They're just better understanding. And that you're something about this expressiveness and this communication. Our abilities to communicate with what one needs are just so woefully lacking. You're attempting to communicate to us.
Right.
That much, as opposed to any results, or products, or methods.
Yeah. At the beginning, I would hope to get something quantifiable and measurable, but no, it was more of the self-expression of each person using it.
We have time for one more.
I wondered if you had done any more with the medical applications earlier, not only for detection, but also possibly for discussion.
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
Did you have any follow-up with the medical study? You said this was being used with all the complicated charts for people with bipolar disorder. Did you follow up with them with what you've done to see if there was any application with them in that situation?
No, I did not.
All right, thanks, Louis.
Thank
So we're going to take a 5-minute break real quick and just get Briana set up and maybe adjust the lighting a little bit.
Just change the lighting. Thanks.
Cool.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, it's been like 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
It's
a very short 5-minute break.
I think we're all set. I think I can hear you.
Yes.
And you're okay?
As okay as I'm gonna be.
Okay.
All right, I think we're ready to go. All right. So I want to introduce Briana Morgan. She's going to be giving a talk titled "The Quest for Wicked Data." So I'm really excited to hear.
I'm glad to hear that. I hope other people are excited too. Hi, I am Briana Morgan. I am a health planner. Raise your hand if you know what a health planner does. Awesome. I feel that way too. So more or less what I do is work with large, primarily public data sets, some original qualitative and quantitative data as well. But I work with data to plan HIV services for people who don't have insurance or are underinsured. That's the short way of putting it. The way I kind of think of it is like city planning for health services. So that's how I spend my time. Mostly. I'm also on the board for PANMA, which some of you might accidentally be here instead of in the room for PANMA, but they're meeting over there right now, which is the Philadelphia Area New Media Association. I also help run a group called Net Squared, which does tech for nonprofits. I helped start a publication called Rebel Public Health, and I do an assortment of talks and things on data and impact. So we're going to start off with a little story about a pretty famous guy in the public health world. Anyone ever heard of Jon Snow before? Not from Game of Thrones. The other one. All right. So Jon Snow was a doctor in London in the 1850s. Like I said, I work in public health. We're really big on data. This is probably the biggest story in our public health data canon. There was a cholera outbreak, 1854. About 150 people died in 3 days. Nobody knew how cholera was spread at the time, and so everybody was running around trying to figure out what was happening. At the time, people assumed that almost everything was spread by smell, which is one of the holdovers from that now is when people aren't feeling well and you open the windows. It's because of an old, like 1800s belief that that would let the disease out. So that was called miasma, the air. And Florence Nightingale, mother of modern nursing, very big on the miasma stuff. Irony. So Jon Snow saw all these people were dying, and he went to the health department, or the health authority at the time. He's like, I would like some more information so I can stop all of my patients from dying, probably bad for business. They're like, yeah, sure, we'll give you that information because we don't know what else to do with it. You know, 150 people dead in 3 days. So he made this really, really famous cholera map and got that guy named Reverend Henry Whitehead. And one of my favorite things about Henry Whitehead is this is a great testament to the importance of working together in public health. He had no health expertise whatsoever, but he did have a lot of gossip about people because he was the Reverend and he knew everybody's business. And so he and Jon Snow went from door to door and they tried to figure out what was going on with the cholera cases. Dr. Snow realized that it couldn't possibly be smell because there were people blocks and blocks away, in a couple cases several kilometers away, who were dying from cholera, and smell doesn't travel that far. Eventually they figured out that it was probably coming from the water supply. There was a water pump on Broad Street that had the best tasting water in London. It was the cleanest water in London, they thought. And people would travel from well outside the neighborhood to get their water there. And so every single case where somebody died from cholera was somebody who traveled to Broad Street to get their water and carry it back to where they lived. So this is the birth of modern epidemiology, which is the study of epidemics. And one of my favorite examples of how you can use data for social impact. So this talk is about wicked problems. I'm going to define wicked problems for you in a second, but I'm probably going to use some other terms throughout this that don't make sense to people. If that happens, please ask me what I'm talking about. Okay, I know like I use a lot of jargon from different fields all the time. I do web and tech and data and public health, and they all converge sometimes, so it can be a little bit confusing. Probably like it was for my friends when I told them I was going to talk at a meetup where I saw somebody do a talk on data analysis in a command line. But wicked problems is a term that arises from social policy theory. It was coined in the 1960s. It has nothing to do with Boston. It has nothing to do with evil problems. These are extremely complex problems. They're problems that you look for a solution for, and you don't even know where to start with them. There's also a new category called super wicked problems, which is like there's 10 criteria for regular wicked problems, and then an additional 4 for super wicked problems. Super wicked problems are the kinds of problems like global warming, where they're really complex and hard to deal with, and also the people who are trying to solve the problem are causing part of the problem. Yeah. Wrap your head around that. So the idea of this talk with the wicked data is what data we can use to address these wicked problems. So the way I usually go about this in my day-to-day, this is my framework. Number 1, identify the problem. 2, identify data sources to quantify the problem. I'm primarily working with public data sets, and any of you can do this as well. So if you want to solve the world's wicked problems, we could use your help. 3, identify limitations to data sources, barriers to data collection, and other contextual information specifically related to the data. We'll have examples for this. 4, seek additional contextual information, including environmental and policy factors. And 5, identify co-occurring problems. I have a simplified version of this. Find the problem, count the problems with counting the problem. Think about all the things you can't count and what a problem that is, and then find out the original problem isn't the problem anyway. This is also probably familiar to any of you who do coding. Oh, jeez. There's mouse up here. It's just dangling. All right, so assumptions for this talk. Number 1, we are exclusively looking at public data sources owned by government authorities. Right? Number 2, aggregate data that is published by government authorities has already been vetted for HIPAA compliance and other state and local regulations. I've come across a lot of people who get very concerned about aggregate public health data. Trust me, it's already been through the ringer. All right, so problem 1 we're going to look at, heroin. This is all like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, by the way. Sex, drugs, and data analysis. Has anyone in here heard anything about heroin in the news lately? Okay. Anybody want to tell me what any of that was? Yes.
It was an SNL skit that made fun of it, and then they got in big trouble.
Yeah, that was
fascinating. It's not nice.
SNL is not really nice though. It's not their bag. Yes.
NPR had a segment talking about how different class of people are now using heroin more often and kind of related to other areas of society.
And also the rise of incidence is exponential. It's increasing at an exponential rate.
Mm-hmm.
Painkillers and can't afford it anymore. Heroin's cheaper, and then they feel so awful that they think that
Heroin being laced with fentanyl.
Yes. I'm going to talk about that too. Yeah. All right. So, yes.
So it was kind of alluded to before, the public perception of heroin is evolving very rapidly with time as the drugs move down to mostly African American communities into rural white communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a huge part of the conversation that's happening right now. Last one.
I have another wider distribution of Narcan.
Yeah, that's super. For those of you who don't know about Narcan, this is really cool, and I'll talk about it in a minute. And so Heroin is all in the news, but people know it's a problem. They can't really quantify it, and they don't know where it started or any of those things. So if you want to start off with my framework of quantifying the problem, we have a list of public data sources. The first one is one of my personal favorites, if you're into this kind of stuff. The treatment episode data set admissions. This is admission data for everybody who is admitted to a rehab program where the facility receives any public money, right? So it's not just people who are admitted to public programs, it includes court-mandated admissions. So that's really helpful because there are a lot of people who normally wouldn't have access to rehab programs who are required to go there. The CDC's behavioral risk factor surveillance system. This is a phone survey. They call people, ask them really invasive questions. The next one, the youth risk behavior survey, is a survey done, paper survey, anonymous high school students. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health, they actually dispatch people to a sample across the country. They do in-person interviews. The CDC's beautifully named Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which is always fun around our office. Vital statistics, so you know, your births, deaths, that kind of stuff. Important for the heroin thing because you'll see cause of death with ICD-10 codes. Drug seizures, arrest records, and naloxone administration. Naloxone is another name for Narcan. So when you're looking at all these public data sources, it's really important to have information about the data source you're working with, right? Like knowing that it's admissions data versus somebody calling and doing a telephone survey. For example, the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, they ask questions about things like whether or not people are exercising or, you know, how many sexual partners they have. Now, if you're having a person call you on the phone that you've never talked to before, and they identify themselves as being somebody from the CDC, and then this is an actual question. I'm gonna read this out loud to you because it's one of my favorite things to happen in public health. I am going to read you a list. When I am done, please tell me if any of the situations apply to you. You do not need to tell me which one. You have used, oh geez, I killed it. Yeah. All right. That's not part of the question. That's going on the blooper reel. All right. You have used intravenous drugs in the past year. You have been treated for a sexually transmitted or venereal disease in the past year. You have given or received money or drugs in exchange for sex in the past year. You had anal sex without a condom in the past year. Do any of these situations apply to you? G, all of the above. And so, like, obviously this is the best shot we have at getting this kind of information, but I would venture to guess that it's slightly underreported for people who have these risk behaviors. And so, you know, they do all the weighting and everything, but there's still, you don't really know what you're looking at. All right, so the highlights from our heroin data. 1 in 10 people used illicit drugs in the past 30 days, we guess, across the country. It's about 13% in Philly. Illicit drugs does include marijuana no matter where you are. So even if you're in Colorado and you're technically cool, depending on who you ask, it's still considered an illicit drug for the purpose of this survey because it's a national survey. We also know the percentage of people aged 12 or older in 2014 who were current heroin users was higher than the percentage most of the time from 2002 to 2013. But it's not a steady increase. What we are seeing is these are drug overdose deaths, right? They're all going up. They are going up much more rapidly among non-Hispanic whites than other race and ethnicity groups. All right, so other factors that are related to heroin that we know about. There's been in the January MMWR, which is the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, there was a sharp increase in fentanyl seizures. Fentanyl, despite being really expensive to be cutting heroin with, is often related to overdoses where you see unexpected amounts of it. Here's a thing that people didn't really realize. Philly has a very, very, very white injection drug epidemic. And I'm going to speak in broad generalizations. This is not to say that no Black or Hispanic person has ever injected anything in the history of mankind. This is the bulk of people who are admitted to treatment for drug use or for intravenous drug use in Philadelphia are white. 93%, this was around 2010 through 2012. And that has always been in the case of Philadelphia. It's actually, people have done ethnographic studies on us. It's a unique part of our drug using culture. For whites who are in rehab, heroin is the most common substance. That you can compare this to other groups, which is, for everybody else, the most common substance is actually marijuana. Remember when I said earlier that this includes court-mandated treatment? Yeah, so a lot of times when you have Blacks and Hispanics who wind up in drug use treatment, it's because it's court-mandated, and you wind up with a lot of people in treatment for things a little bit questionably, like marijuana. And there's also been a huge increase in rural drug injection. So if we go back and look at this again, what's not reflected in this chart is this is driven by people who live in rural areas and suburbs. All right, so this is a map of Narcan administration. So Narcan, or naloxone, is a drug that you can, like anyone can administer to anyone who's experiencing a heroin or opiate overdose. It reverses the overdose, and it's a pretty big deal. Our fire personnel, EMTs, police, and some other first responders are starting to carry Narcan. So this was the first 6 months of 2015. And the first 6 months of 2015, the fire and EMS administered it 1,258 times, which is a lot. I don't know how good you guys are with maps of Philadelphia. I look at them a lot. So I will point this out. This right here is where City Hall is. That is the far northeast. This is Chestnut Hill, Mount Airy, South Philly. So this one, where the bulk of these are, is Port Richmond. This over here, 19113, is Fairhill, otherwise known as the Badlands. It's where a lot of the heroin dealing is happening in Philly. Yeah.
Are these confirmed to be drug cases? I mean, Narcan Administration is on protocol for any unknown unconsciousness situation.
They're all Narcan administrations.
Okay.
And so one of the other things that's important to know about this too is that this is not correlated to 1,258 overdose deaths averted either, because you don't know who would have died from an overdose. But so this is a really nice illustration of where the hot spots for these things are. It's also important to note that a lot of times people use where they score and not where they live, which is part of the reason you'll see that. Yeah.
I think the question was, Narcan will be administered whether or not the person had any heroin. So is there any
well,
close all the
right, but it's not just, if you walk into if somebody were to call the EMS here and there was someone unconscious on the floor in the middle of the talk, no one's going to give them Narcan. Probably. I would be very surprised if that happened.
You would kind of average out. You would not see, the math would still be the same. I mean, the number of unconscious people for random reasons is probably proportional to the population.
Yeah, I want to see it times.
I think it would be
Yeah. So there are definitely contextual factors involved based on the conversations that I've had with the people who administer Narcan. Yeah.
Narcan means what?
Narcan is the drug that reverses overdoses.
opiate.
Yeah. All right. So that's that. Although I'm interested to look into that more. That conflicts with some of the information I've gotten, although I absolutely believe what you're saying. All right. So what else do we know about heroin usage in Philadelphia? So in Philly, we have syringe exchange, which is different from a lot of our surrounding areas. We also know that there's been an increase nationally in opioid dependence, which started a long time ago. Opioids are a blanket term that include opiates, so that'll include morphine, codeine, heroin, And there used to be an issue with overprescribing painkillers. And seeing what was happening with addiction, the feds cracked down on prescribing a lot. But what that did was squeeze the supply of available drugs like Percocet and codeine. And so that drove those prices up. And consequently, people turned to cheaper options like heroin. There are also some competing markets. So now that you see legalized marijuana in so many areas, people who made their money off selling marijuana or illegally are looking to push other things, heroin being one of them. And then we also have the ethnography related to drug use in Philadelphia. All right, so what's missing? We don't know how many people actually use heroin. There's not a census for that. And so when you're looking at all of this stuff, we have information about, you know, the Narcan administrations. We have information about who's getting admitted for treatment. We have all of that. We have stuff from the DEA about who, like what their drug seizures are, what they're seeing as far as drug trafficking, but we don't actually know anything about the population, not in a real population level. All right, second problem, teen STD rates. All right, we have all of these data sources, Pennsylvania STD data, Philadelphia STD data, teen births, which aren't actually related to STDs directly, but it's the same behavior that gets you an STD, gets you pregnant, usually. The behavioral risk factor surveillance system, youth risk behavior survey, HIV surveillance data, and the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. All right, so this is a table for STD rates for Philadelphia public high school students who are tested at school. So you can see people have been talking about this for years and they keep talking about like the problem never went away. It really peaked in about 2010 to 2012 where around, you can see, this is terrible by the way, 10% of female students who were tested for chlamydia and gonorrhea were positive. For high school students.
So that's percent tested, not as a fraction of overall students.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
What indicate why would you test it for some students that get in trouble? You go get tested.
That would be awesome,
Yeah,
actually. I'm pro anything that encourages more STD testing. But no, they have health resource centers in some of the schools. So it would be that kind of situation or a health fair. It's usually elective, but you know, if you're doing a good job at health education, you're getting higher positivity rates, but jumping from 6% to 10% in 6 years isn't necessarily great.
So this sounds like it's very self-selective.
Right. So generally, and this is not all the time, but generally, if you're exhibiting symptoms for something and somebody provides a confidential way for you to get tested and not have your parents find out, and it's convenient and free and all of those things, generally people will take advantage of it.
But then, as you educate more and more people,
Mm-hmm.
more and more people think, oh no, I'm worried, I need to better get tested. The testing population increased, but the numbers
Yeah, that's
like that.
we like to call that the worried well for HIV testing. And so there are it happens, don't get me wrong. And I think everybody knows at least one person like that in their life, where no matter what it is, they'll go get tested for it. But for the most part, you have to be really highly motivated to seek that out. And high school students especially. I mean, if you think about all the stigma associated with getting an STD test in the first place, even if you know you should probably have one.
Raw numbers.
For this,
Yeah. If you had, in 2010 to 2012, the actual number of people who got tested decreased. I mean, if you're getting if you had 1,000 people in 2005 and 15 people in 2012.
right. Well, it's not anything that stark. It is in the, what's the Philadelphia Department of Public Health annual report that includes STD figures. And so they're relatively stable. At this point in time, Philadelphia was making national news because we had the highest STD rates among high school students in the country. And so like this is not the only data point for this. And the last time we did a youth risk behavior survey, we found that 38% of Philadelphia high schoolers were currently sexually active, which I believe was defined as having sex at least once within the past 90 days. And 42% of them did not use a condom at their last encounter. More importantly, 22% of all Philadelphia high schoolers had said that they had had 4 or more sexual partners. So if you combine that with the 42% of them did not use a condom at their last sexual encounter, that implies that they're taking some pretty risky behaviors, which would lead to those kinds of STD rates. What else do we know in Philadelphia? There is no mandatory sex ed for students in Pennsylvania schools. In Pennsylvania, there's a requirement to teach some HIV education with a focus on abstinence, but that's it. Around the time that the STDs started dropping, we just so happened to introduce a free condom campaign for teens and youth. I would venture to guess that the drop in STD rates and the availability of free condoms for youth are related. And another important thing to think about are social networks. And so once you have somebody who has a particular communicable disease in a social group, the disease is more likely to spread among the people within that group, just the same way if no one in this room has a cold, you're not going to get a cold, but if somebody walks in and sneezes and they have a cold, somebody else might get one, right? We mapped this with the Jersey Shore at my office for fun one day. Like in a theoretical situation where you had a transmission every time, how something would spread through the cast of the Jersey Shore. I learned a lot about my coworkers and how much they've seen of the Jersey Shore. But what's missing in this data set? Well, there's the actual sex behaviors. We don't know what people are doing, and we really don't want that information anyway. How many people are undiagnosed? So there are a lot of, you can live for a long time with a lot of different STDs and not even know you have them. And here, this is a hideous slide that I made at some point to prove a point about how you can't really get a lot of information about teens as a whole in Philadelphia because our data sets don't match up. So if you look at teens defined as 13 and 19, which is the conventional definition, it's all the ones that end in teen. We have STD data for 10 to 14-year-olds, and for 15 and 19-year-olds, we have teen births for under 15, 15 to 17, 18 and 19, drug use for 12 to 17-year-olds, drug use for 18 to 25-year-olds, risk behaviors for 18 to 24-year-olds, HIV we actually do have for 13 and 19-year-olds, and then totally separately, we have the youth risk behavior survey, which is done by grade level, right? So like if you're trying to find out what's going on, combination of drug use and sexual behavior and teen births for 13 and 19-year-olds, you can't really do it in a cohesive way. And that's with age, which is really easy to quantify. Imagine how messy that gets with race and ethnicity and other such categories. So we can do a little bit better with this. One of the things that I like to point out is that not everything should be a fight for open data. Open data is a really hard sell for people like public health authorities. A lot of times you don't actually need individual records for stuff. I know it's a lot more fun to play with and you can do a whole lot of really cool data viz stuff with it. But at the same time, it's not the thing that we always need the most. If you're looking to raise awareness about a cause or do service planning, aggregate level data is enough. And especially for people who don't have advanced experience with working with data, people who want to do advocacy for their own communities, for example. Those people are looking for just basic public data availability. And so the difference between public and open data, for anyone who doesn't know, open data is machine readable, it's more spreadsheets and stuff. Public data is just having public data that anybody can go on a website and look at. Our public data system or situation right now isn't stellar. This is one of my favorite examples from the Pennsylvania Department of Health. To download data, highlight, then copy and paste. A very liberal use of the term download. That's your tax dollars at work. There's a uniform crime report from the Pennsylvania Police Department that you can download. that automatically downloads an Excel 2.0. If you don't know what that is, because I had to look it up, it's the version of it's the second version of Excel that was released in 1987. And then this is one of my personal favorite examples for hating on technically public but not really public data. This is from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This is a data set with 3,120 public variables, which is awesome, but you can only sort it by a geographic area if you apply. The application's 20 pages. It has its own manual, and they review applications once a year.
Wow.
So technically public, but not really in the spirit of the thing. And one of the most important questions to ask when you're looking at public data sets is who's missing, who's not counted, what's not counted. One thing that there is no national data set for at all right now is trans people. It does not exist. Another thing is anyone who is undocumented, drug users, anybody doing any kind of illegal activity, people who have illnesses and haven't been diagnosed yet, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm going to leave everyone with a challenge, and my challenge is to pick a social problem that is important to you, find a public data source, and try to use it. And then maybe just share what that experience is like with someone. You can share something you learned, which would be great, or maybe you'll find an opportunity to advocate for change in the way the public data is shared. So thank you all. You can find me on the internet at my website, brianalmorgan.com. You can sign up for my newsletter that I apparently started the other day, and I don't know what's going to go in it yet, at tinyletter.com/brianalmorgan. You can find me on Twitter at Babe from Toyland. Obviously, there's a hashtag. So thank you. Anybody have any questions? People raise their hands with questions before I asked. That's never happened to me before. Start with you.
So the two biggest things I noticed with this data, which is like the big problem, I guess, is one, you have some data going back to 99 compared to 2015, and you see like these huge increases. Do you ever investigate, like, was there a difference in like the accuracy or how effective they collected data back then versus now, because people are so now interested in data? Is that driving an increase? And then the other thing is, which you touched on, is when people self-report like health statistics, you don't often get accurate answers. How many drinks have you had? Some people underestimate it. Any other thing you ask them. So how do you know, like, do you prioritize what type of data you rely on versus not? Because I saw some statistics like based on self-reported health survey answers. So it's like when I see that, I don't really I don't grab it too tightly because I just say I can't really know what that means.
Right.
Someone reported it themselves.
All right, so I remember the second part of your question. What was the first part?
Points in time.
Points in time, right, okay.
Better,
yeah. So always read the documentation that goes along with any public data source, and that'll give you a lot of information about the number of people who are involved and what their methodology is. I think that knowing methodology for a data source is one of the most important things about using one. And so that kind of goes into the self-reported thing as well. In terms of self-report stuff, I would take it with slightly more than a grain of salt, depending on what it's about. But a lot of times it's the best information we have. And so when you're looking at risk behaviors and that kind of stuff, like, you're never quite going to get at exactly what's happening. And that is part of the wicked problem. Yeah.
There is like some population who's part of their job getting into testing. So transportation workers, athletes have to do it, increasing high school athletes. Is that big a problem?
Well, so in terms of testing and in terms of what it's for, it really depends on, actually the answer is usually it depends on who's paying for the testing, right? So if it's public testing dollars, then you can get more information about it. If it's a reportable disease and somebody shows up positive, you get information about it. If it's, say an HIV test being done by a private insurer and a person comes up negative, you're probably not going to get that information. You might if they decide to share it just for fun, but people don't usually do that. Yeah.
So there's a lot of analytics you can do with data, even if it's a bit messy, but what are you doing with it? Are you targeting certain populations based on what's high risk? Are you trying to develop high advocacy reliability, or what's the general goal?
So I can tell you what I do with it at my job. So where I work, we plan HIV services for a 9-county area. It's in Philadelphia, 4 surrounding counties in Pennsylvania, and 4 in South Jersey. And so everything varies throughout those areas. One of the things that we do, we use some GIS analysis and other wonderful things to look at what's going on in different areas, give them to our planning body who makes funding decisions, and they choose what services to fund where and what service or what targeting they want to do for populations. We also provide all of the data we use in a public format to the public, and we target it to service providers in our area. And so a lot of people in our 9-county region use the information that they get from our data documents to do their grant writing and their own service targeting. We have some, but it's more in the system level, like we're gonna help you with this information, and less an individual partnership. Yeah.
So I think there's a very strong link between crime and heroin. I think that's what our police department tells us. I wonder, since you said people use and collapse close where they purchase the drugs, but they probably steal from crimes where they live. Can you use that data to figure out which communities are at risk? Is there a link?
Well, so it's interesting. Using heroin habits are really expensive. Most people use several times a day, and it's, depending on where you are, like $5 to $10 each time you use, which is, like, if you do the math, it's a lot of money. And so people are kind of just wherever they happen to be. In terms of general crime, I mean, you can't assume that all crime is related to drugs. Usually drug use is related to crime, but it's not necessarily the other way around.
When we get a spike in crime in my community, we're told, oh yes, it's related to heroin.
It's right. I am not willing to venture to guess on the causality of the crime in your neighborhood. I would assume that the police department knows a lot more about it than I do. Hey,
Sorry
Tim.
about that late, but we have a lost set of keys from somebody who helped get the keys in here, not me, but a friend who runs the orchestra. So if anybody finds a set of keys with a red remove before boarding tag on them, please come find me. I'm wearing the purple shirt, and no, I did not plan that this morning. But,
and are you over in 250?
Yeah, I'm next door to 250. So if anybody sees me, please, by all means, bring my way. Thanks. Sorry I can't be in 2 places at once, Briana.
Me too. I hope your talk went well.
It did.
Yes.
So obviously, so you can go public data set, you can do your analysis and find insight. So who do you share it in? So when you work, let's say you want to share that insight with the public officials in your city or town, how do you go about it?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Well, I would start with what kind of figuring out what kind of change you want to happen. Sometimes the way to go about it is to talk to public officials, and sometimes it's not. I'm trying to think of a good example for it.
We're talking public officials.
Well, so there are a couple of issues at play, right? Like, is it something public officials can do anything about? Sometimes the answer is not really. Sometimes the answer is they can do one thing about it, but it's not going to be the thing you want to happen, right? Ideally, we would have fewer people who were living with addiction to heroin, right? But we already have that situation. And so a lot of times it might look like implementing syringe exchange in a neighborhood where people might not be super excited about having syringe exchange, but the problem's already there. And so, like, there's a lot of that kind of stuff. You always have to think about the many, many, many external factors, and also any policy restrictions. There's a situation with, right now the feds are doing a lot of work around heroin addiction. And one of the things that they're looking at is trying to get Congress to lift the ban on syringe exchange. It goes up and down with what you can spend federal funding on. Right now, they're letting people spend money on stuff related to syringe exchange, but not actual syringes. And so knowing what system you're working within too. But if you want to take some data to a public official and you can get that contextual information before you go in to have that conversation, you'll get a lot farther with it. Yes.
I just got a question you brought up earlier about people, I guess, squeezing and making it harder to get certain narcotic drugs. I guess just in your field of practice, do you know if when, I guess, the federal government makes a decision to cut down because of abuse, they factor in the inflation of things like heroin as a result of the decision they made?
I mean, they think about it, but what are they going to do about it?
Well, I mean, you can leave it as it is, and people won't use heroin, but they'll use these drugs.
Yeah, but then you still have a whole lot of people who are dependent on opioids, and you're like getting new ones, right? And so like when do you address the problem? And that's what makes it a wicked problem, right? Like you're kind of screwed no matter what you do. Yeah.
Has analysis of the public data ever allowed you to put together a broader story that says, somewhat like that, but says that, if you do these things that you don't think are very good or popular, there are other ramifications that an overall benefit cost analysis will put this far ahead. Has that ever happened?
So this is one of the things that I absolutely love about looking at social policy, because it's so complex, you can't really answer that. I did a lot of research in 2014 on the local implementation of the National HIV/AIDS strategy, right? And HIV cases are going down, mostly in most groups. Overall, total count going down, new infections in Philadelphia. Certain populations, about a quarter of our new infections are among people 13 to 24, which is alarming, but whatever. The national, like, and you're like I said, you're screwed no matter what you do, right? Like you focus on one population, then the other populations get bad, and it's just the nature of the beast. And so we're working on that. But you look at the National HIV/AIDS strategy, which started in 2010. And it was this huge coordinated effort. It was done by executive order instead of legislation. Like if you're into political science stuff, it was fascinating the way they did all this kind of stuff. They changed the way that the feds awarded all of these grants down to cities and states. And there's no way to know if that's the actual thing that's making infections go down, because there's so much other stuff. You have more people who already know what their status is. We learned a lot of really important stuff recently about treatment for people who are living with HIV and are in treatment and their viral load is undetectable. There's a very, very, very small chance they'll transmit the virus to somebody else. So that happened at the same time the policy went into effect. And the number of confounding factors when you're looking at social policy is massive, which is kind of terrifying when you look at politicians and government officials trying to pass policies and make things work, because the more you look at this stuff, the more you realize that there's no way to know it's going to work, and they don't know, and they're just really doing the best thing they possibly can, hopefully. But yeah, the causation with policy is really rough. The opioid prescriptions to the heroin is pretty clear because there's been enough research on that. But yeah, long answer. Yes.
I'm not sure if I understand. Back on that question, and if this is even appropriate for this forum, but I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm.
My impression is that teenage smoking rates over the past 30 years is sort of like a good story in public health.
Mm-hmm.
And I recognize it's outside of your purview, but I just want to know if there's great stories from the fight against teenage smoking that apply to your world as well. If you don't just mind me asking you a question from the 30,000 foot view.
Yeah, so the Truth Campaign, which if you guys remember, everybody remember the Truth Campaign? Anyone remember the Truth Campaign? Is just like a public health thing, legend. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a campaign against teen smoking and called the Truth Campaign, and it was amazingly successful. We are really having a hard time right now with e-cigarettes and vaping. terrible. Like teens are taking that up like nobody's business, which is interesting because teens stopped smoking for a while, for the most part. But yeah, that kind of stuff is really big and cultural and takes a long time to make happen. And so with smoking, the behavior existed for a long time, and we were able to see what it was and have clear causality in terms of illness and all of that kind of stuff. But it's been around a lot longer than a lot of our other public health issues. And people have been working on it for a long time. And that's hard. Soda is a big one right now. Yeah.
You look at all that social media, official public data.
Oh, that's one of my favorite topics. There's been really cool predictive analysis done with social media in Chicago in terms of looking at what people are tweeting and then food poisoning outbreaks. That's super cool. But there's also a lot of people missing the mark with social media. A lot of public health is rooted in academic analysis. And a lot of times by the time a study, like somebody sees a need for a study, gets funded for the study, publishes the results of the study, like you might have something now coming out about MySpace. It's, yeah, it makes my heart hurt. So there are people doing really innovative work with it, but in terms of getting the data out, it's a little bit more, everybody figures it out like they go, just like any social media professionals do. All right, so thank you.